I woke to the taste of ash in my mouth, as if my life had burned itself to cinders overnight. The morning sun, pale and judgmental, filtered through the gauzy curtains, painting the room in shades of regret. I pressed a trembling hand to my chest where my heart still hammered out a frantic apology for the mistakes I'd made, mistakes I'd hoped time would bury in quiet earth, but which instead had sprung up like stubborn weeds in my bones. They said I'd come home from the hospital a different person, and they weren't wrong. When I returned to the house that once felt like sanctuary, every corner echoed with a hostility I barely recognized. My daughter's voice, usually warm with concern, was clipped and hollow. My grandchildren, bright-eyed once, now busied themselves with screens, as though my presence were an intrusion. The potted plants I had so lovingly tended wilted on the windowsill, their leaves curling away from the light. Even the dog, old Rufus, turned his head with polite disinterest when I kneeled to scratch behind his ears. I understood why frailty makes people uncomfortable. It stares them in the face and demands questions they cannot answer. It burdens the young with responsibilities that siphon away patience and affection. So they kept me at arm's length, feeding me motley scraps of affection that tasted of obligation. All that changed the morning my daughter needed my credit card. She stood at the kitchen island phone clamped to her ear, her voice a practiced blend of urgency and fatigue. "Mom," she said, "I just need to borrow your card for a few days. You know how things are." I watched her flick the ringlets of her hair, the motion habitual, almost unconscious. But I'd seen it before. There was an art to her performance, a choreography of helplessness that ended with my wallet lighter and her coffers heavier. I hesitated, and that split-second hesitation cracked something loose inside me. I saw as clearly as if someone had ripped away a veil the whispered lies about overdraft fees and surprise expenses, the pleas for just a little more that never ended the way my bank account thinned month by month until I felt as if my own memory was paying rent to the roof over my head. "I'm sorry," I said, voice small but steady. "I'm not comfortable giving it to you." Her eyes, so like mine, flicked up in surprise, then narrowed. In that flash, I saw the calculation how much more precious those rare moments of control had become for me after the doctors told me I might not walk unassisted again. She slammed the phone down and leaned forward, her breath warm with indignation. "This is my house," she spat. "You don't get to pick and choose." The kitchen light caught the edge of the porcelain mug in her hand. Before I could snap, a warning brown liquid arced through the air and exploded against my blouse. Coffee, hot and bitter, sizzled down my chest like molten regret. For a heartbeat, I stood frozen, the coffee's sting igniting every nerve. Then something ancient rattled loose, a voice deeper than fear, more relentless than pain. I pulled off my blouse, glaring at her as though she were a stranger. My lungs, weak from the hospital bed, protested, but I breathed anyway. Slow, deliberate. My hands knotted with arthritis, clenched into fists. "Don't you dare tell me this is your house," I said, each word a pebble dropped into a pool of growing clarity. "I built this house with my own 2 hands, raised you in it, and I'll be damned if you treat me like a stranger." The room tilted as I spoke, but I held my ground. Something inside me had shifted, a fragment of the woman I once was. Before the strokes, before the years of polite silences, rising to claim her space. She recoiled, surprise flickering across her face. The grandchildren peeked around the doorway, their tablets forgotten. I heard the catch in her throat, the unsaid defenses colliding with the echo of my own voice. For the first time, I realized how thin the walls between love and manipulation could be. The coffee stain darkened on my blouse, and rather than rush to the sink, I let it seep into the fabric, a testament to that moment of awakening. My heart still pounded loud enough for them to hear, and as the weight of 50-odd years pressed on my shoulders, I felt lighter than I had in months. In that charged silence, I tasted freedom. It was bitter like the coffee, but also bracing and real. I folded my arms, bone and muscle and stubbornness, and waited. The children watched, unsure. My daughter's face had gone pale. Perhaps she saw at last that I was not the frail fixture she could bend to her needs. I would have to rebuild piece by piece, reclaim what she had chipped away at. My pension, my dignity, my right to say no. And so in the hush of the kitchen, I made my choice to harness this fierce clarity and insist on respect. To prove that even after life's worst storms, the core of your soul can still spark to life. The afternoon sunlight dripped through the curtains like liquid amber pooling across the living room floor, where I sat still in my stained blouse, fingertips tracing the coffee ring on the armrest. My body trembled not from pain, but from the surge of something I hadn't felt in years, fierce aliveness. The scent of scorched earth and burnt beans clung to me, and I realized that even the ruins of my dignity could become foundation for something new. I rose slowly, testing the strength in my legs. They wobbled under me, but they held. The cane in my hand felt suddenly familiar, no longer a crutch, but an extension of resolve. I moved toward the hallway mirror and studied the reflection, the silver hair cropped close around my temples, the lines etched around my eyes like rivers carved over decades, the shoulders bent by grief and hard work. Yet my gaze was clear, fierce with an authority I had long surrendered. Footsteps approached, soft and hesitant. My granddaughter Zoe hovered at the threshold, eyes wide. Usually she buried herself in cartoons or whispered secrets into her tablet, but now she watched me as though seeing me for the first time in years. I beckoned her forward. "Come here," I said, my voice gentle. She edged closer, then brushed a strand of coal-black hair behind her ear. "Granny," she whispered, "what happened?" I cupped her cheek, tracing the imprint of childhood. "I remembered who I am," I told her, "and I'm going to make sure no one forgets again." That evening, I pulled out the faded folder where I kept every statement of my pension, every bill, every receipt. For so long, I had let my daughter handle the finances, her voice soothing her promise of, "I'll take care of it," a balm for my tired mind. But that balm had turned corrosive, eating away at my independence. Now I studied the columns of numbers as if they were a map to my own destiny. My hands shook at first, but with each line, I read the tremor of fear subsided. I stood up and called my daughter into the room. She lingered at the door, arms crossed, face guarded. "I want to handle my money from now on," I said plainly. "I'll give you the bills you can remind me of, due dates if you wish, but the account is mine." Tension crackled between us like static. For a moment I feared she would lash out again. Instead, she turned and walked away, shoulders stiff, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Nightfall found me at my desk, an old oak table scarred with coffee stains, and the memories of letters written long ago. I lit a single lamp, and began to write lists of expenses, plans for medical appointments, notes about my personal wishes. As the words filled the page, I felt the years of manipulation and isolation unspool behind me. The pages in my hand became a shield and a sail guiding me toward calmer waters. In the days that followed, I noticed small shifts. My daughter no longer asked to swipe my card. Instead, she left me alone to reconcile my statements. I refused her help packing my lunch and paid the corner cafe myself, letting the barista hand me back my exact change. Zoe, once a shadow in the background, began to visit more often, asking for help with her homework, inviting me to read stories aloud. In her questions, I heard the echo of my own desire for purpose, and I realized that by honoring myself, I was also teaching her to honor others. One morning, as I watered the thirsty plants on the windowsill, I paused. Their leaves, once drooping, now stood proud and glossy. I saw in them the truth of my own resilience, that life endures even after storms of neglect and pain. I whispered to them, as I used to whisper to newborn seedlings, words of promise that they would thrive, that I would thrive. Late one afternoon, I felt another tremor of fear, a wave of doubt that threatened to sweep me back into old patterns. My daughter was due to arrive, and I dreaded the possibility of confrontation. But I carried my folder, my lists, my newfound clarity like armor. When the doorbell rang, I opened my heart as well as the door. I greeted her calmly, offering coffee, black, no sugar. She stared at the steaming cup in my hand, confusion flickering across her face. I held her gaze and smiled steady as the autumn sun. In that silent exchange, we both understood that the balance of power had shifted. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of the journey that began with a single refusal and a splash of hot coffee. I thought of every time I had softened my voice to placate, every time I had said yes when my heart longed to say no. I thought of the woman I had been before illness tethered me to dependence, and the woman I was reborn in that small eruption of courage. Sleep came gently, as if honoring the peace I'd claimed. In my dreams, the house was filled with light, every corner open and honest. My voice was strong, my steps unhurried. I woke with the same quiet certainty that waking itself is an act of defiance, and living fully is the greatest rebellion of all. The next morning I woke before dawn, drawn from sleep by a stirring in my bones, a quiet insistence that the day ahead be different. I rose without hesitation, letting the cane guide me as I shuffled to the small desk by the window. Outside, the sky was soft gray, heavy with promise. I opened the worn leather journal I'd begun the evening before and read the words I had scrawled. I will not shrink today. The phrase felt like a vow, and I closed my eyes to let its power sink in. Coffee was my first ritual, no longer a storm of humiliation, but a personal ceremony. I measured grounds with a careful hand, poured hot water in a steady stream, and inhaled the rich aroma. As I sipped, warmth traveled down my throat and settled in my chest. I was reclaiming even these smallest moments. Later, I dressed with intention. I chose a blouse of soft blue mouth-watering against my skin and a cardigan that reminded me of spring buds. I combed my hair with slow deliberation, smoothing down stray hairs and admiring the way the silver strands shimmered in the light. I felt myself assembling an armor of self-respect. Descending the stairs, I found my daughter in the living room phone, tucked between shoulder and ear eyes fixed on her laptop. She looked up, startled. At first I saw impatience flicker across her face, but then something softer emerged, perhaps recognition of the boundary I'd set the day before. I nodded at her without speaking. She lowered her gaze and tapped a finger against her cheek. "I'm going to the bank," I announced. "I'd like you to come with me if you wish." Her eyes widened as if I'd offered her a bouquet of stones. She opened her mouth, closed it, then swallowed. "If you want company, sure," she said, voice unsteady. "I'll come." We walked out together, me hobbling slightly on my cane, her cast in a reluctant shadow. In the car, neither of us spoke. I watched her drive, hands tight on the wheel, as though she were navigating uncharted territory. I could feel her question in the silence. "What have you become?" At the bank, I presented my card and ID with a calm certainty that belied the tremor in my fingers. The teller greeted me by name, Mrs. Tran, the official way, and smiled as though seeing me for the first time. We reviewed my account together. Deposits, withdrawals, the balance solid, with months of planned budgeting. On her screen, the numbers glowed like a constellation I once thought extinguished. "This is yours," I said to my daughter, when we were alone in the parking lot. The sky now bright and clear. "I manage it. You can help me if I ask." She nodded, lips pressed thin, and for a moment I wondered whether she feared this newfound strength. But she did not argue. Back home, I spent the day reading letters I'd written to friends long ago. Thank you notes, birthday cards, invitations to weddings and christenings. My grandchildren spilled in and out of the living room, their laughter like ribbons of light. I called Zoe over and showed her a note I'd penned to her mother when she was her age. "Your mother used to think I was funny," I said, voice soft. "I want you to remember, you come from laughter." She leaned against my knee, curious. I told her about coloring contests I won in first grade, how I once saved up coins to buy ribbon for a ribbon-cutting ceremony I organized at the neighborhood store. She giggled, her own spark of rebellion glinting in her eyes. "Will you teach me to do things like that?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "I will. And I'll teach you to say no when you need to." It was the middle of the afternoon when the tension returned to the hard edge of unspoken grievances. My daughter walked in, arms folded. "Your pills," she said, nodding toward the medicine cabinet. "I organized them for you." I felt old guilt seep in at the reminder of my dependency, but I held firm. "Thank you," I replied, "but I want to manage my own schedule now. I'll set a reminder, and if I need help, I'll ask." Her jaw tightened. "You're going to forget," she said. "You're not yourself." I recognized that tone, the disappointment mixed with fear, the desire to protect that suffocated. I took a breath, imagining those wilting plants transformed into the proud green leaves they'd become. "I used to forget," I said quietly, "but not anymore. I'm taking responsibility for my life." Perhaps it was the steadiness in my voice, or perhaps she saw how my eyes held their own light. She exhaled and nodded, her shoulders easing. She didn't offer further objections. And in that small surrender, I sensed respect taking root. That evening, as the household wound down, I slipped into the garden behind the house. Under the boughs of the old jacaranda tree, I knelt beside the remaining plants. The soil was damp, alive with worms and tiny insects. I worked my cane aside and dipped my hands into the earth, planting new seedlings I'd bought earlier that week, bright marigolds, hopeful purple petunias. With each seed nestled into its bed, I felt I was sowing my own renewal. The cicadas began their evening song, a steady hum that matched the quickening of my pulse. I straightened and surveyed the garden, my kingdom, my refuge. In the quiet of that moment, I understood reclaiming my agency was not a grand gesture, but a collection of small acts, refusing the card, balancing my own books, choosing my own pills, tending the garden. Each gesture a testament to the life still pulsing through my veins. I returned to the porch with soil-stained hands and dirt smudged on my jeans, a smile curving my lips. Inside the house was quiet, my family settling into rest. I poured a glass of water, then sat by the window and watched the last light stain the sky. My reflection stared back at me, an elderly woman in soft blue blouse cane leaning at her side, hair silver as dawn, and I knew without doubt that this was the beginning of everything. In the weeks that followed, life shifted slowly but irrevocably. Small gestures of autonomy grew into rhythms of confidence, becoming as natural as breathing. My daughter and I spoke less, but when we did, our words carried an honesty that had long been absent. Our silence was no longer strained with resentment, but charged with a cautious respect. One morning, as the dawn light seeped into my room, I heard whispers in the hall outside my door. Zoe's voice was clear and insistent, her youthful confidence a balm to my soul. "Granny isn't confused. She's just brave enough to stand up," she said. A warmth blossomed in my chest, brightening my day before it had fully begun. That afternoon, I found Zoe alone on the porch swing, kicking her feet gently as the wind rustled the jacaranda branches above us. Her tablet lay untouched beside her, the screen black and forgotten. Her gaze was distant eyes, thoughtful, beyond her years. "You okay, love?" I asked, lowering myself slowly onto the swing. She shrugged, avoiding my eyes at first. Finally, she turned to me, her brow knitted in confusion. "Why did Mom act that way? She always says we're supposed to take care of family. But I saw her yell at you. It scared me." I reached for her hand, clasping it gently between my own, feeling the softness of youth and the quiet strength blooming beneath her skin. "Sometimes people love in complicated ways, Zoe. They believe they're protecting us, but they can end up hurting us instead." She nodded, processing my words carefully. "Will you ever forgive her?" I sighed, hearing the depth of wisdom in her innocent question. Forgiving isn't about letting someone keep hurting you. It's about letting go of the hurt itself, so it doesn't control you anymore. She tilted her head, curious eyes searching my face. "Have you let go yet?" I paused, feeling the weight of the question settle inside me. "I'm working on it," I admitted. "Forgiveness comes slowly, like growing flowers. You have to keep watering it." Zoe squeezed my hand and leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. "I want to be brave like you, Granny." My heart swelled, pride and sorrow mingling together in my chest. "You already are." Later, I sat alone at my desk, penning letters to old friends whom I'd lost touch with after my stroke. Each word felt like reclaiming pieces of myself, tiny fragments left behind in forgotten corners. I wrote about my new independence, my garden, and even my daughter, acknowledging both the hurt and the hope that lingered in our fragile reconciliation. By evening, a stack of sealed envelopes rested beside my coffee mug, each a step forward, away from isolation. Days turned into weeks, my steps growing stronger as my confidence blossomed. My garden flourished under my attentive care, vibrant with color, a living metaphor for my own renewal. I spent hours tending it, letting the sun warm my skin, and feeling a sense of peace as the earth yielded life beneath my hands. My daughter watched from a distance, often lingering in doorways, as though caught between resentment and longing. Sometimes our eyes met across the room, brief acknowledgments of the shifting landscape between us. Once or twice, I caught glimpses of vulnerability, moments when her mask slipped, revealing her own exhaustion, her fear of losing control. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in gentle shades of violet, she joined me unexpectedly in the garden. She knelt beside me, silently watching as I carefully uprooted weeds. Without words, she began to work alongside me, her hands tentative, uncertain. The silence stretched neither of us, willing to disturb the fragile connection forming between us. Finally she spoke, voice barely audible. "I don't know how we ended up like this, Mom. I never meant to hurt you." I looked at her, studying the face of the child I'd raised now, marked by years of complicated love and quiet battles. "I know you didn't," I said softly. "But love can't thrive when it's used to control. It needs space to breathe, to grow on its own terms." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, catching the fading sunlight. "I wanted to protect you, but I ended up losing sight of you instead." "Maybe we both lost sight of each other," I murmured, brushing dirt from my hands, feeling its roughness grounding me. "But it doesn't mean we can't start seeing clearly again." We continued working quietly until darkness fell, guided only by the moon's gentle glow. When we finally rose, she offered me her arm, not out of obligation, but as an act of quiet solidarity. I accepted, and for the first time her touch felt sincere, free of manipulation or resentment. That night, as I lay in bed, the house settled into silence around me. I felt lighter, a sense of quiet victory warming my bones. The fractures within our family were beginning to mend, not neatly or quickly, but slowly, authentically. We were each growing stronger in our own way, healing independently, yet side by side. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply into the peace I'd reclaimed. Life was far from perfect, but perfection was never the goal. Authenticity, dignity, and self-worth were the treasures I'd recovered, the gifts hidden within my own strength, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. In the gentle hush of night, I heard Zoe's soft laughter from the next room, the murmurs of a storybook read aloud by her mother's careful voice. It filled me with quiet hope, a promise of better days yet to come, tempered by wisdom, courage, and the unwavering strength to hold on to myself no matter the storm. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, holding a scarf my husband had once gifted me, a deep burgundy silk patterned with delicate cranes. It had been folded at the back of a drawer for years. I draped it around my shoulders and watched my reflection. The woman who looked back at me no longer seemed like a ghost drifting through borrowed spaces. She stood upright, eyes steady, hands folded not in surrender, but in quiet power. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to my daughter, not even to myself. I had already done the hardest thing. I had claimed my life back. But still, as the days rolled by, I noticed a strange grief settling in. It was subtle and complex, a mourning not for my physical health or even my past, but for the illusions I had clung to. I grieved the mother-daughter bond I'd believed unbreakable. the comfort of trusting blindly, the simplicity of a love untested. Even as my daughter made gestures toward reconciliation, a shared dinner, a walk around the block, there remained an unspoken truth between us. She had crossed a line, and I had drawn another. She seemed to realize it too. We spoke carefully now, like two women learning the geography of a new relationship, navigating not as mother and daughter bound by history, but as separate adults cautiously trying to meet in the present. I began keeping a small journal next to my bed. Every night I wrote down 3 things that affirmed me, small triumphs, moments of strength, joys I refused to let pass unnoticed. One entry read, "I said no today, and I didn't feel guilty." Another, "Zoe and I danced to old Motown songs. She says I have groovy knees." Some nights I simply wrote, "I am still here. I matter." That journal became my lighthouse on the darker days, especially when the loneliness crept in. Because even freedom, I learned, comes with solitude. There were days when the silence of independence echoed too loudly, when I missed the false comfort of being needed, even if it had come at a cost. And then one evening, something unexpected happened. I was sitting outside watching the wind bend the garden grass into rippling waves. My phone buzzed beside me. It was a message from my younger son, Min, who lived in another state and rarely called. Zoe told me everything. "Are you okay, Mom? Want me to visit?" I stared at the message for a long time, my throat tightening. I had not spoken openly to him about what had happened, too ashamed, too weary. But Zoe must have told him, and he'd reached across the distance. Not with accusation or advice, but with care. "I'm okay now," I replied, "but I'd love to see you, when you can." A few days later he arrived. He hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack, then held me at arm's length to study my face. "You look like you again," he said, smiling. We spent the weekend reminiscing, walking through the neighborhood, eating noodle soup, and laughing about old memories. I told him about the coffee, about the confrontation, about the slow reclamation of my life. He listened without interruption, nodding eyes brimming with quiet fury and pride. "You should have told me sooner," he said gently, "but I understand why you didn't." I nodded. I didn't know I needed to. Not until I remembered I had the right. That night he sat at the dinner table with my daughter. Their conversation was civil tense in places, but it was the first time we had all sat together in peace. Min didn't scold her. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a reminder that I was not alone, that someone else had seen me, believed me, and come. As the house quieted and I stood washing dishes at the sink, my daughter approached. "You're stronger than I thought," she said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. "No," I replied, drying a plate. "I've always been this strong. You just forgot." She said nothing, but she nodded slowly and walked away. That night I stood in my garden beneath a sky bruised with starlight. I felt the cool air settle against my skin, smelled the faint sweetness of marigold and mint. I closed my eyes and breathed in deeply, holding that moment of stillness like a prayer. I had weathered the storm, not unscathed, but unbroken. I had uncovered the truth buried beneath a lifetime of sacrifice and silence. I had confronted love corrupted by control. And I had chosen at long last to love myself more than the comfort of being needed. My hands lined and aching curled around the garden gate. My cane leaned beside me. I stood tall, not because I was healed completely, but because I had decided I was worth the space I took up. And in the silence in the dark, I whispered to myself, "You are free now. Go gently. Go forward."